Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today's episode is a special live recording of PPF that we did last week with two schools in Doncaster, for people who are not based in the UK, that is in Yorkshire, in the north of England, Hill House School and Hayfield School. And it's a conversation between me and the political scientist Rob Ford about what it would mean if Nigel Farage became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Would it be unprecedented? Is it going to happen? What might stop it? Our audience was made up of pupils from the two schools, aged between 14 and 18, as you will hear at the end when we take some questions from the audience. Some of their parents, some of their teachers too. This is a conversation about British politics, but as you'll also hear, it touches on a lot of the themes that we've been talking about in our series, Fixing Democracy. Just before we talk about Nigel Farage, I have a first question for Rob, because he has just come hot foot, as people used to say, from the Conservative Party conference where he was speaking at a fringe event. And this is relevant for what we're going to be talking about now. Dead yet?
The people at the conference didn't seem to think so, but you wonder if it's rather like the person who walks out happy from the doctor's surgery having failed to realise the gravity of the diagnosis they've just been given. So I think that they haven't fully internalised the magnitude of their defeat. But aside from the psychology of the Conservatives themselves, I think it would be very unwise to declare them dead with 4 years to the next general election, given that 4 years ago I was at a Conservative conference where everybody was talking about how Boris Johnson was the master of all that he saw and would be governing for another 10 years. So we live in very volatile times. The Conservatives have definitely been on the sharp end of that volatility in the past few years, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility that they pick back up again and the roller coaster takes a new turn.
Right, so that is part of the context of what we're going to be talking about here. But I want to start with some history, because I think the thinking about historical comparisons is often very useful, but it's particularly useful when something seems to be happening for which there doesn't seem to be any historical precedent. So we're thinking about how and what it would mean for Nigel Farage to become Prime Minister. It is certainly something that is now possible. I think we can agree it is definitely within the realms of possibility, and we'll get on to the question of whether it is also probable or not. But were Farage to become Prime Minister, do you think it would be an unprecedented event in British political history? Or to put it another way, can you think of any comparable figures to Farage, first of all, among the people who have been Prime Minister, but maybe also among the people who could have been Prime Minister? Because he is now in that space. He's in the space of someone who is at least having to be thought of as a potential Prime Minister. Do you think he is a unique figure in British political history, or that there are historical comparisons we can draw on?
I mean, I think he is a little bit unique, and I'll come on to why at the end, but I think there are some historical overlaps, maybe not full precedents, but there are areas where you can see resonances from the past. And I think there are two figures in particular, one in terms of their politics and their disruptive impact in very much the same sort of political space as Farage is now in, and the other in terms of their structural role in being an engine of party system change, which is what will have happened if Farage becomes Prime Minister. So in terms of the politics and the disruption, the politician I think he resembles most, though not in terms of his biography or his general personality, is Enoch Powell. So Powell, for those of you who don't know in the room, was a senior frontbench Conservative politician in the 1950s and 1960s. He was, which is somewhat ironic given what happened afterwards, actually the Health Secretary who encouraged active actively encouraged migration from the Commonwealth into the NHS, said we can recruit as many workers as we need to staff the NHS by bringing people over from the Caribbean and South Asia. He was himself a massive India-phile. He'd spent a long time in India, classically trained scholar, intellectual. But he's mainly remembered today for essentially two things. One thing in the sort of general political culture, one thing amongst politics nerds like myself. He is remembered for his views on immigration. He gave the very famous Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, in which he argued in very combustible, inflammatory language that mass immigration posed a serious threat to the cultural continuity of the British nation. He famously described it as being like a nation busily heaping up its own funeral pyre. Now, he was immediately expelled from the Conservative front bench after making that statement and never served in a senior role within the Conservative Party again. But because of his statements, the Conservatives became associated with a much more strident approach on immigration and have been ever since. The second thing he's remembered for is he was one of the first politicians to argue for the use of referendums, and played a key role in the fact that we had a referendum over EU membership in 1975. So in terms of the politics of referendums and Brexit, he was also a crucial pioneer for the kind of politics that Farage produced.
And in that referendum, he campaigned for us to leave the EEC, which we'd only joined 2 years earlier.
Precisely. And there's a very amusing anecdote that I remember when I was reading one of the books about the 75 referendum, about the other very prominent politician of that period who was campaigning for leave in that referendum was Tony Benn. And they wanted to have them on the same stage arguing the case for leaving the EEC. And Ben refused outright to share a stage with Enoch Powell under any circumstances. They even proposed putting a great big divider down the middle of the stage so that Ben wouldn't have to look at Powell, and he wouldn't do it. So yes, so in terms of the politics of Brexit, if you want to know why we had a referendum on the EU, Enoch Powell is in two ways part of the answer. One about the politics of immigration, the other about the politics of referendums. Then in terms of structural roles, and again, definitely not in terms of biography or personal politics, the politician that Farage will end up resembling most, if he ends up being Prime Minister, is Ramsay MacDonald. As Ramsay MacDonald spent 20 years in the political wilderness building a new political party, a new political movement, the Labour Party, and then became its first Prime Minister as a result of reshaping the patterns of party competition, reshaping the political system around a new divide, a divide over class, mobilising the working class into politics. Farage has been engaged in a similar project for the best part of 2, maybe 3 decades now. And if he ends up in Downing Street, it will be the culmination of a 25-year process of change. So that's where the precedent is, I think.
So those comparisons are really interesting. I'm going to suggest 2 ways in which he doesn't fit with those two, and then we can see where we are. So with Enoch Powell's one of those people who was for a long time talked about as a future Prime Minister until he made that speech, effectively, at which point he made himself a kind of outcast. And then he got expelled first from the front bench, eventually left the Conservative Party altogether, ended up standing as an Ulster Unionist and representing a seat in Northern Ireland. But he started as an insider. He was a quintessential insider, and he moved to the outside. It feels like with Farage, the story is very much the other way around, not least because, I don't know what you think about this, but I would say even 2 years ago, if we'd been in this room, and you'd said to me, we're going to be having a discussion about whether Nigel Farage might be Prime Minister one day, I would say, well, how are we going to fill the other 49 minutes of a 50-minute conversation? Because the answer is no. I mean, 2 years ago, I wouldn't have thought, 2 years ago, he didn't look like he was going to be in Parliament, never mind Prime Minister. And it's happened so quickly. That's the thing that feels different. And that also then relates to the comparison with Labour. So I want to ask you about this in a second, which is what does happen when a two-party system kind of swaps out one of the parties for the other one. And the Ramsay MacDonald project in the first 3 decades of the 20th century was essentially to replace the Liberals as the main party of opposition to the Conservatives. But it was a sort of incremental, step-by-step process. You get a few MPs, then you get a few more, and you get a few more, and it was election after election. And it took 30 years, and it was a 30-year electoral struggle. The thing that feels like it would be completely different this time is to go from 5, or is it 4, or is it 3 at the moment? However many they've still got, MPs, to enough to form a government in a single parliament. And something about the speed of that feels like it would be different from the attritional struggle that Labour went through, first of all, to establish themselves as a plausible parliamentary party, then conceivably as a party of government, by getting more and more people into Parliament. This will just go from none to all of them.
There's a lot to both of those points. And in fact, the point about the outsider, that is the way in which I think he is unique and different to both of the previous figures that I analysed. I mean, MacDonald was an outsider in various respects. But yeah, Enoch Powell, who then made a break with the party and then weirdly didn't follow through on it. It's one of those kind of great what-ifs of history. If you look at the polling between 68 and about 72, people are asked who would be your preferred candidate for Prime Minister. Powell was always in the running and often topped the poll. If he'd have launched some sort of a party in that period, it might have produced a similar kind of disruption to what we have now back then. But one of the ways in which the Conservatives in particular keep misunderstanding Nigel Farage is they think he's a lost sheep of their flock. They think he's going to come back. They think he'll hostile take over the party, or maybe he'll come back, maybe he'll do a deal. He has been campaigning against Conservative politicians since he was a young man in 1993. That's 32 years, pretty much his whole adult life. He is not a friend of the Conservative Party. He's had many opportunities to become a friend of the Conservative Party and has spurned every single one. So he is a quintessential outsider in that regard. And then when it comes to the electoral system, I think that is true up to a point, because it is also true that when you look at Labour's progress in the 1910s and 1920s, it comes with its own discontinuities. There is a big bounce up when they overtake the Liberals, I think, in 22. So there is that moment where it sort of goes up vertiginously, because that's the nature of the first past the post electoral system. You know, UKIP, Farage's previous outfit, got nearly 15% of the vote in 2015 and got one seat. So 0.2% of the House of Commons. And that guy was a Tory defector. So those 15% of the vote, they were not represented at all. But there's a certain point with our electoral system where if you're an evenly spread political party, you go from being second or third everywhere to winning everywhere, particularly when the rest of the system is fragmented. So the system produces those effects. It's never produced a sort of springboard bounce of that scale before, but the possibility of it was always there.
Yeah, and I want to ask you a bit about what the Conservative Party potentially could do to stop we haven't quite reached the tipping point, but I think today another 20 councillors defected, and there is a point at which it starts to become seriously irrational to believe that the Conservative Party have a way back if Reform look like they are the main opposition to the Labour Party. On Farage himself, one of the very interesting details in his biography is he always says he started out as a Tory, and in the 80s he was just a Thatcherite. He was a true blue Thatcherite. He loved Margaret Thatcher, but he felt the party was betraying him over the question of Europe. He was an early adopter of a kind of Euroscepticism. And so in 1989, or is it 7, the European elections at the end of the 1980s? 89. He looked desperately around for a party that was as Eurosceptic as he was. He wanted to find a party that hated the European Economic Community as much as he did. And he finally found one, and he voted for them. And can you guess which party it was? The Greens. So British politics has a weird habit of turning itself completely upside down. The thought of Nigel Farage voting Green, that is the first party he voted for when he stopped voting Conservative. Just gives you a sense of how febrile the European issue can be for British politics. So I want to talk about scenarios by which he could become Prime Minister. Then I want to ask you whether you think it will happen. But before that, I want to talk about some of the ways it might happen. So there have been a series of polls, these mega polls that they now run across constituencies that have a good record of predicting the outcome of elections, but not 3.5 years in advance of those elections. But they've moved, even in the last 6 months, from predicting that Reform UK, to give them their full name, would be the largest party in a hung parliament, to suggesting that they might win a majority. So the simplest way that Farage becomes Prime Minister is he wins a majority at the next general election. But let's park that one for now. Let's go to the scenario that's one notch down from that, which is Reform win 250 seats, 280 seats, maybe even 300 seats. So they're the largest party in a hung parliament, but they do not have an overall majority, which to me at this point you're the expert, seems probably more likely than an overall majority. Were that to happen, does Nigel Farage become Prime Minister?
I think it's actually quite a difficult question to answer because it will hinge very much on the identity of the other 350 MPs. I mean, to give one example, which I don't think is probably the least likely in this scenario, if the Conservatives were then completely wiped out, they had like 5 MPs or whatever, then you would have 305 MPs broadly on the right. Maybe you could add in the DEP, probably not, given some of the things that Farage and Reform have said about things that are relevant to the sensitivities of, the Northern Irish border and so on. You'd struggle to get them. And everybody else is anti-reform. So I think you end up then with a rainbow anti-reform coalition. However, the more likely outcome is something like 300 Reform, 50 or 60 Conservatives. And then the question becomes, who are those 50 or 60 Conservatives and where do they see their interests lying? Because they face a difficult choice. All of the other parties potentially will be saying, don't let this guy govern, it's dangerous. There's potential in this scenario, of course, also for substantial market upheaval, which we have seen several times in recent political history, is a pretty significant factor in determining how the power brokering process goes. As Jim Carville famously said, if I'm reincarnated, I want to come back as the bond market because then you can bully everybody. If the bond market is crashing, there'll be a lot of pressure to form a government. And if the bond market whisperers think a reform government will be dreadful, the capital will flee the country, there'll be a lot of pressure on those Conservatives to form an even broader rainbow coalition, potentially pass electoral reform and do a new election under a different electoral system that wouldn't disproportionately benefit reform to that extent. Now, the obvious objection to that is going to be, you lost and now you're trying to rig the game. And of course, Reform will make that argument from day one. So it really does come down to the identity of those 50 Conservative MPs and what pressures they're most responsive to, what options they consider in the best long-term interests of their party. And that's a very difficult question to answer from where we are right now. Elections are also psychologically shocking processes when big change happens. So those people will all be quite shell-shocked and sleep-deprived. And so not for the first time in British history, the stumbling decisions that get made by a bunch of sleep-deprived politicians under great pressure in a few days might end up determining the path we take for decades to come.
And that's one of the ways in which the British political system is not geared up for this. So other proportional systems, there's an understanding it takes a long time to form a government. The markets will remain calm because they also understand that. But anyone who remembers 2010 and the formation of the coalition government will remember the rising tide of kind of hysterical, panicked commentary that we've been 48 hours, 72 hours without a government. The economy is going to collapse. We're going to turn into Greece. And on no sleep, a coalition was cobbled together. So doing it under those circumstances is pretty difficult. And then the other thing is British politics doesn't have any experience of that, at least the possibility of that kind of, as it would be called in other countries, popular front coalition to stop the party that is furthest to the right. So France does have a lot of experience of that among the voters as well as among the politicians. And my instinct tells me psychologically for British politicians, the scenario that you mapped out, which is those rump 60 Conservatives deciding, rather than throwing their lot in with Farage and maybe saying one of us needs to be Chancellor to calm the markets, maybe Robert Jenrick, which I believe at the Tory conference, his nickname this week is Nigel's Chancellor. Rather than that, they say, let's go in with the Greens and a few of Corbyn's people and the Labour Party and the Lib Dems and the Scottish Nationalists and Plaid Cymru to form this kind of popular front. It feels like a psychological leap too far in a country that just has no tradition of that.
I think that's true, but I think it's also true that when this scenario has come to pass, Conservative politicians will know two things, one very recent and one still fresh enough in the memory that they'll all be painfully aware of it. The first is that they have spent 20 years successfully saying to voters, a vote for Farage is a wasted vote. You've got to vote for us even if we're not Nigel. But by this point, the first past the post system has turned that argument on its head, and they look like the wasted votes. So That's one thing that will be at the front of their minds. The second thing that will be at the front of their minds is what my colleague Tim Bell likes to call the Black Widow spider theory of the coalition, which is David Cameron won a majority in 2015 by forming a coalition with the Lib Dems, the smaller party, and like the female Black Widow spider, the Conservatives then just ate the Lib Dems and took all of their seats at the next election. So a scenario where 60 Conservative MPs, almost all of whom will likely face Reform as their strongest local opposition party, form a coalition with them or prop them up in a minority government, the risk is that then they're the male Black Widow spider and they're just going to get eaten next time. So I agree on all sorts of grounds, ideological, cultural, the direction of the Conservative Party post-Brexit, the likeliest outcome is they go for it because it's much less alien than the other option. But fear of imminent demise can do strange things to politicians' minds. And I wouldn't be surprised, for example, if the Conservative Party split over the issue and sufficiently evenly to make a stable government essentially impossible and force another election relatively quickly.
So that was the other scenario I wanted to ask you about. And we don't know what will happen, but one of these scenarios may well happen, so it's worth thinking about them in advance, which is actually it is impossible to form a majority government. There is no coalition that works. So British politics does have an alternative to that, which is a minority government. That is the party that won the most seats. Its leader is invited by the king to form a government. And so he says, fine, I'll form a government. And he fills up the cabinet with people from his party. And then the question is, can that person pass any legislation? And they're given a chance to try. And you have to assume there's no problem for the other parties. There's no problem in voting down whatever Farage proposes. But the risk there is that really does feed the narrative, which is we won the election, we've been invited to form a government, we're going to try and pass a budget. If you can't pass a budget, your government has to fall under the terms of our constitution. Here's our budget. They voted it down. So we have another election, but this time we're going to the people saying, you see what happens when your votes produce a reform government, the establishment just blocks us. And then they do win a majority.
Yes, perhaps. I mean, I think there are some lessons from Europe on that front. So even under more proportional systems, this scenario has come to pass a number of times. A lot of European countries, there's quite a broad consensus against not letting the radical right into power, but you've ended up with sometimes quite convoluted minority government type arrangements, or the centre-right provides the prime minister, but the radical right is providing the votes in parliament. That's a model the Dutch have pursued a couple of times. And it's very, very unstable, firstly because one of the features of the populist radical right is they don't actually like the hard decisions of government, and their voters don't like facing up to the hard realities that come with those hard decisions. So governing is not always very good for them in terms of popularity. And secondly, it hands a lot of power to the other parties to essentially pull the trigger on it, collapsing the government at a time that suits them. So the most recent Dutch experience ran longer than I was anticipating because Wilders went up in the polls, so everyone else went all sort of quiet. And then as soon as he drifted back down again, they pulled the plug. So it might be that they do get a budget passed, particularly if it's a budget that the Tories can find a lot that they like about. But then if people decide that they don't like what Reform are delivering, or all of the extravagant promises that Reform made on the campaign trail, none of this stuff is happening, much as, what gradually happened with Brexit as well, then, if you're a Conservative MP, you're watching the numbers tick gradually in your favour and just pick your moment to bring the government down.
So I'm not a politician and I'm not a political tactician, but if I was Farage in those circumstances, I would propose a budget that couldn't pass in order not to have to face the hard choices of government, but to do the thing that does suit his brand of politics, which is to say, I told you so, they're blocking me.
That is, I think, a fairly plausible scenario as well, the kind of amp up the crisis scenario and get yourself one more leap up to a majority.
Which doesn't delay the business of it delays the business of governing, but it doesn't put it off indefinitely, because then you do have to.
No, you end up with a 2-election year or something like that.
So we've been talking on the basis of predictions as though there were an election tomorrow, but there won't be an election for 3+ years. What are the things you think might derail Reform and its current level of popularity? Or alternatively, do you think there's further for Reform to rise? So that sometimes I think there's a feeling that there is a ceiling for the kind of politics that Farage is offering, and he might be quite close to it, especially because the party system is fragmenting and people have so many places to go. So two sides to this question, one of which is that tipping point effect. Do you think it could actually gather momentum? And Conservative voters do start to think a Tory vote is a wasted vote. And actually there is quite a lot further that reform could go. But alternatively, in the next 3 years, if they are close to their ceiling, are there things that could bring them back down to earth?
I mean, the first thing I should say is that as someone who's studied the politics of Farage for about 15 years now, I would have put their ceiling at somewhere between 20 and 25%, and they're obviously polling above that. So they're above the ceiling I would have anticipated, which does suggest some change or expansion in the nature of their appeal. On the other hand, if you look at, for example, the question of do you like or dislike Nigel Farage as a politician, and the British election study asks us this question on a 0 to 10 scale, he gets the most 10s and the most noughts, and there's a lot of noughts. So there clearly is a ceiling somewhere, but it's higher than we thought, and it's high enough under first past the post when it's this fragmented. So he could win a majority of the Commons, so more than 50% of the seats on 28, 29, 30% of the vote because of the way all the other parties are divided. So first question is, could that come to pass? Well, here in Doncaster, that is exactly what came to pass this past May in terms of the Doncaster City Council. Reform got 36% of the vote, and they now have a 2/3 majority on the council. We saw this all over the country, County Durham, Kent, a lot of places, Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire. That could well carry on happening. So you could end up with a very large presence of reform in local government. And to the question of, like, could they keep going up or going down? This is one of those examples where they're potentially faced with a double-edged sword. Because on the one hand, talk to Lib Dem activists, Labour activists, they'll say presence in local government is a real engine of organisation for parties. Councillors get out and knock on doors, they deliver leaflets, they also deliver stuff for people in local communities that makes them sort of a felt presence. So this is potentially a way that reform institutionalise themselves. On the other hand, they're taking over local councils that are often in a kind of slow-motion, giant financial crisis. And a lot of these people are completely inexperienced in politics. I think the guy running social care on Leicestershire Council is 19 years old, and he's now presiding over a budget of billions of pounds for very vulnerable people. So the potential for that to blow up in their faces in terms of scandal, incompetence, internal division is very high. And again, the UKIP precedent is interesting in this regard because UKIP won a bunch of council seats in 2013, 2014. And by the time those seats were up again, 4 years later, there were virtually no UKIP councillors left because they'd all left the party for one reason or another, were feuding with each other. You'd have councils where there were 3 different UKIP groups, like something off of Monty Python. So the potential for them to buckle and crack under pressure is quite high. And I think one of the really big unknowns with them is they've put a lot of time and effort into trying to professionalise. I think they're sincere about that because one thing about Farage is he learns from his earlier errors. That's why he keeps getting better and stronger. One big unknown is whether or not they can deliver in these kinds of scenarios because they're almost victims of their own success peaking so quickly because now there's years of scrutiny to come. So that kind of thing could take them to 35% and then, real majority territory, or slow motion scandals, local and national level, could pull them back down again. So scrutiny cuts both ways. You're the centre of attention, which is potentially positive, but you're the centre of scrutiny as well. I mean, if you're an investigative journalist in this country right now, exposing malfeasance and scandal by reform politicians is going to be how you can potentially make your name. I think it can be argued either way. So I'm not going to do a Mystic Meg and say which way it'll go, but I think it could go either way.
On that comparison that we talked about earlier with the Labour Party, as you said, there were dramatic shifts, but also it was a steady attritional accumulation of not just victories in the Commons, but experience in the Commons and so on. The thing that would be unique in this case is going from 5 to, say, 300, because that will be 295 people who have never been, presumably, an MP before. There'll be some defectors from the Tories, but the majority of them. And they will presumably be more of a cross-section of British society than the conventional political class. My guess is the kind of people who would wind up in the Commons, a bit like when the SNP cleaned up in 2015. All sorts of surprising people, you might call them ordinary people, found themselves members of the House of Commons. Do you think that's a weakness or a strength in the sense, in an age of anti-politics, anti-system politics, anti-establishment politics, at the next election, having a slate of candidates, there are going to be some people who the journalists won't have to dig too hard to find something shocking in their social media history or whatever it is. But you'll also get more of a range of people that people think, well, that's not your typical politician. Is it a net plus or a net negative?
I think it's a net plus in a representational sense, definitely. You see, I mean, a lot of my colleagues spend a lot of time debating the degree to which the House of Commons represents the people it governs. And they focus an awful lot on gender and ethnicity, and rightly so, because the Commons was overwhelmingly male until very, very recently. It's still only 40% female now, and that's the highest it's ever been. This is the first Commons that's ever been as ethnically diverse as the country it governs. And, you know, you only have to go back a couple of decades to be able to fit all of the ethnic minority MPs into one small van. On the other hand, there's another element of representation that doesn't get as much attention, which is university graduates versus non-graduates. We live in a country where about a third of the voting public went to university, and over 90% of the people governing them went to university. And that is important because university, not just about your educational experience, university is associated with a whole cluster of values and worldviews. There are education divides on all sorts of very important political issues. So the fact that there's this huge divide matters. And the fact that Reform win their votes very much from the non-university side of the divide and kind of walk the talk on that in terms of the people they put forward are much more, as you say, people from more everyday professions, people who haven't gone to elite universities, who haven't, you know, gone through the worlds of spaddery and think tanks to get to the top. That's a strength for them in the context of an election campaign. But I think it's also a major weakness when it comes to governing. And again, the examples of radical right parties in Europe are quite instructive in this regard. Governing is hugely complex. Populists like to pretend that isn't the case, but it is. And voters do not reward failure in governing. Point number one. Point number two, party management is hugely complex. And when you've got a bunch of people who have no experience of politics, it's much more difficult. They're much more likely to flame out, argue with each other, say something on the TV or the radio that they shouldn't, that gets everybody into trouble and starts an argument. So, you know, the kind of noble amateur has an electoral appeal, but generates all sorts of headaches once you're actually trying to run an administration in the Commons, particularly a rickety minority administration. So I think it's both a strength and a weakness.
There's another example of this, which is Macron in France and En Marche, when they originally came in and he swept the board in the parliamentary elections. You got a very diverse selection of people relative to the professional sort of école classes of French politics. But we're now far enough on in that experiment to know that it didn't work. It's also true that the current Labour cabinet, the Labour Party makes a lot of this. I believe it's true. It's the first one where everyone in the cabinet went to a state school.
Yes, but they also all went to university.
Exactly. And in a sense, that is a much more relevant fact when you look at them. You don't look at them and think, oh, look, that looks like a bunch of state school educated people. You think, that looks like a bunch of politicians. What's the distinguishing mark of a politician? University, and then many of them straight into, as you call it, spaddery or something similar. In Farage's terms, never having had a real job, which remains one of his strongest calling cards in politics. Not that he's particularly, I mean, he was a stockbroker for a while. You know, he's been in politics for a long time, but nonetheless, he can plausibly point to his opponents and say they come from a very narrow subset of the wider population, which is people who from an early age made this their profession. It's a kind of anti-professional politics pitch.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think I've learned about the political class, as it's often sort of derogatorily called, but I think there is something to it. It's often overcooked. But when I moved from studying politics in terms of polling and surveys and stuff to studying politics in terms of talking to lots of people in politics, I swiftly realised that there's a kind of vocabulary and almost a tone of voice that you get in the political class that comes from being in this space and speaking to all of these same people all of the time. It's quite incestuous in that way. And one of the reasons Farage kind of comes across as more authentic, and the claim that he's an outsider comes across as credible, and there's all this stuff about, oh, you went to a private school and you're the son of a stockbroker, falls flat, is because he does speak in the manner and with the language and the gestures of ordinary people, because he isn't from that world. And from very early in his political career, he set himself up against that world. I mean, I still show my students videos of Farage in the European Parliament because he was so effective at speaking in this populist, anti-elitist tone of voice, which is not actually an easy thing to do. You see someone like Robert Jenrick's trying to do it, and it comes across as so contrived. He can do it naturally because it is his natural politics. And that's one of the ways in which I think that hidden division about a university-educated professional political class, he kind of brings it to the surface.
I found myself thinking this just listening to Keir Starmer after the attack on the synagogue in Manchester, and he made a statement saying all of the right things. But in that statement, he said, and I want to reassure the Jewish community that we will be deploying police assets across the country. And I thought, no one says police assets, right? No person who's not a politician says police assets. It's not, what does it even mean? It's someone's written it for him from that world. And then I thought, Farage might have said all sorts of things, but he would have called the police the police.
Yeah,
and it's a tiny thing, but if it wound me up...
Exactly. It would have been, we're going to have cops on the front of every synagogue. Easy peasy. And a colleague of mine who worked in the world of like polling advice to political parties and stuff, this once told me a story about trying to advise centre-left parties, not just here, but across Europe and so on. And he said they all want their buzz phrases. They all want, what's the phrase? What's the tagline and all this? And he would get them to like brainstorm the kinds of phrases they think would land really well with voters. And every single time he would say, too many syllables. These would be 3, 4, 5 syllable words, abstract words, whereas the language of everyday life is concrete, it's short, it's blunt, it's direct. But these are people who have never really talked like that to each other, so it doesn't come naturally to them.
So I want to mention 2 people we haven't discussed so far, but you may be thinking of these people in the background. One is Trump and the other is Putin. So 2 things that could happen, and I want to know how they might impact it, because we are an island, but this is not a world in which being an island will save you from anything when the world kicks off. So first, an American asked me this the other day. He said, I assume the Farage bubble is going to blow up when Trump blows up the American economy, which this person said, I believe is going to happen in the next few months. And at that point, presumably, Farage blows up with it. And I said, well, I just don't know, because Trump blows up the American economy, he will damage the British economy. And politics is a pretty simple business. If the government is presiding over an economy that is struggling, people look for the main party or opposition to give them a kicking. So the question is, does Farage's association with Trump mean he kind of gets dragged down as Trump's coat and coattails go under, if that happens? Or does it mean just the familiar laws of British politics kick in? If by that point he is the alternative to an increasingly unpopular government, he's fine.
It's a fascinating scenario in an academic sense. It's not a scenario I want to come to pass. I don't think it's in anyone's interest.
Well, wait till you get into my next scenario.
But I think it's fascinating because I think you can make a really credible argument in either direction. So scenario 1, this is great for Farage, is, as you say, my former PhD supervisor, Steve Fisher, is fond of saying, there are 2 things. There's one thing that tanks a government, which is a recession or a financial crisis, currency crisis, back in the days when we had fixed currencies. There's one thing that can save them, it's a leader change. And so a financial crisis for an incumbent government is disastrous. It's the worst thing that can happen. And this is already a government polling at 20%. And the natural place for those votes to go is to the opposition, in particular because it's often low attention, low engagement voters who are, focused on bread and butter issues, the price of a weekly shop, the jobs available and so on. Very bad. And they'll say, well, this is the alternative. The other scenario is one of the reasons Farage has got to 30% in the polls is because right now immigration is as salient with voters as it ever has been. And a narrative has taken hold that all of British politics is about immigration, that it's an argument about the effect that immigration has on our nation, our nation's identity, our nation's future. This has become a hugely polarizing debate. And that actually moving the discussion back to the bread and butter of economics might be beneficial to Farage's opponents, both in terms of the Labour Party, because they can make the argument, with things so unstable, you cannot risk this person, but also because it simply means you're not talking about immigration. And Reform are not so credible, not so engaging, even for their core voters, on economic issues in general. But for one very specific reason, you mentioned Farage's love of Margaret Thatcher. Many activists in Reform UK, from Farage on down, Richard Tice, lots of others, they are small state, cut the state, free market Thatcherites. Their voters emphatically are not. Now that disconnect. Farage is aware of it instantly, but he's not aware of it. He does not really come up with a solution to it. That disconnect's not visible when you're focused on the terrain of immigration and identity. It becomes very visible if you're in a financial crisis. So it can go, I think, either way. I'm being very evasive, aren't I? It could go, but there's a lot of uncertainty about this because we've also never had a situation where a government lives through a recession and there's a new and untested. Well, actually, we have with Ramsay MacDonald, of course, and that's one of the ways he ended up in office, and then also ended up becoming a kind of pariah for his own party.
Last question from me. The other thing that can save a government beyond a leader change is a war. I told you wouldn't like my next scenario. Say Putin invades somewhere other than Ukraine. In the last election, I may be wrong about this, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but my memory is that reforms support peaked and then dropped off at the end because of some of the things that it tied with some of the things that Farage said in debates and so on about Putin. His view about Putin in the Ukraine war did not chime with most of the public, including some of his supporters. If Putin puts it to the test, two things hold. One, people do rally round the flag and the government. Say Putin invades a Baltic state. You can imagine that would really make people just think we need to cling to the established way of doing things. But also, his association with Putin, to me, is much more damaging for Farage than his association with Trump, at least potentially with British voters. Do you think at that point, actually, Farage as Prime Minister ceases to be a realistic option?
I would be less kind of on the fence with that one than with the economic crisis one, because I think there's very little upside for Farage in that scenario. The move to a kind of national security crisis will favour the incumbent government, will favour the traditional parties of government. It would actually play to one of the Conservative Party's last remaining brand strengths, which is that people still remember them favourably in terms of defence and security and the response to the initial Ukraine crisis. I also think Farage's attitude towards Putin and his statements about Putin, they're kind of bizarre for a politician that's normally so disciplined about his communications and about shutting down potential weaknesses. I mean, those statements in the Nick Robinson interview at the end of the campaign when he was basically saying, I warned about Putin and NATO brought this on and all this kind of thing. That was a very strange hostage to fortune. It's a completely way out there position. The public don't back that at all. And right now it's not really an issue because Ukraine is faded back into the background, unfortunately, in many respects. But if you're talking about a war with NATO members, potentially that is then a Europe-wide security crisis, perhaps a worldwide security crisis. Those comments will become deeply problematic. And I don't think it's in Farage's nature to run away from those comments, because if it was, he wouldn't have made them in the first place. The electoral logic for making them just isn't there. And even if he was to try and run away from them, that again cuts against his core brand of authenticity. If you're Starmer or Generic or Badenoch at this point, you can have it both ways. If Farage refuses to disown those comments, you can pin them to him. If he runs away from them, then they'll say, look at this. He was all for Putin a little while ago, and look where that got us. So I think it would be an unambiguously negative scenario for him, and it would make it much harder for him to end up in charge.
So all it needs is a war.
What do you suppose the reason for Farage's popularity with the younger generation is? Like, what's made him more popular with the younger people?
I think it's important to bear in mind that two things can be true at the same time on this question. Firstly, Farage in 2025 is more popular with young people than Farage in 2020 or Farage in 2014 was. But he's still, in relative terms, much more popular with the over 60s, the over 70s than he is with the young. There's a very strong age gradient on reform support. So he is more popular than he used to be with young people, but that doesn't mean he is, relatively speaking, more popular with young people. Greens are much more popular than Reform with young people, for example. That said, why has that popularity gone up? Well, I mean, I can give an example almost from my own personal experience. One of the few politicians my kids who are sort of secondary school age have opinions about is Farage, and that's because he's on their social media feeds. He's someone that they see. He's someone whose statements, whether they agree with them or not, they're aware of. So he's proved adept. And let's remember, he's a 60-something. This isn't necessarily natural terrain for him. He's proved very adept at adapting to new communications formats. So I think that's a big part of the reason. I think a second part of the reason is I don't think the immigration message lands as much with younger voters. Some, yes, others, no. But the system is broken and it's not working for you. Why shouldn't you try something new? Aspect of reforms populism. I think there is a big market for that amongst young people who have, let's face it, experienced nothing but decline for their whole lives in this country. So it's no wonder that message might resonate with many of them.
Rob and I were talking about this a bit beforehand. You may know this, two most popular politicians on TikTok are first Nigel Farage and then second Zara Sultana, who's the person who's trying to form a new party with Jeremy Corbyn. And they have very different styles in that Farage seems like he's taking the mickey out of himself quite a lot and therefore out of politics. And Zara Sultana is incredibly serious and earnest. But it's like those two poles seem to be quite appealing. Either don't take it seriously or take it more seriously than these slightly robotic, university-educated politicians who are in between those two poles, and then when they appear on TikTok, it's just excruciating.
Yeah, and also the common element of their message is the system is broken, those robotic politicians are part of a broken system, we are something different, we are with you, we are authentic. So there's also that anti-system populist element, setting themselves up as against that and different to that. I think that's one of the ways, I'm a little bit of a skeptic often about the idea that social media is a big driver of change, but I think that's one of the things that you can already see is changing some of the dynamics in politics. It's so much easier to set yourself up in that way as a I'm with you and against them type politician.
So this is a room with a lot of young people in it, and here we are, two middle-aged men sort of age-splaining to you. So does anyone want to talk about your views about or your experience of Farage or what you think he stands for?
I think he's mostly preying on people that don't really have, much of a view on any other parties. I feel like he's just enforcing hateful views about immigration. I feel like that's his main driving point. And I feel like people who don't really know the other policies he has, I feel like the immigration policies are the only things they actually see. So I feel like he's just using that and kind of scapegoating immigrants to fuel his votes. That's what I think about him.
So not one of the young voters attracted by Farage then? I mean, I agree with a lot of that. And the truth is that this kind of politics, the populist radical right, everywhere in Europe you see these parties now. I think Ireland's the last country that doesn't have one. And in every single case, if you crunch the numbers on what predicts support for them, it's always immigration, always the number one reason. Not always the whole story, but it's always the biggest part of the story. So I think you're exactly right. That has always been core to his appeal. And the scapegoating of us against them, it's a huge thing in politics today. And it's a huge challenge for parties that don't want to engage in that kind of scapegoating because there is a market for it out there, particularly when people are feeling angry and frustrated. They want something or someone to blame for it. And Farage is providing them with a simple story of blame. This is why stuff is bad for you. These people are getting the things you're not getting, and so on. And often it doesn't have to be true to feel true for these kinds of voters. So it's a story that they can tell themselves and each other that they find attractive. And that's hard to fight.
You were at the Conservative Party conference today, in part speaking at a fringe meeting about immigration. The Conservatives under Kemi Badenoch have more or less, I think, assumed they got to compete with Reform and Farage on this territory, essentially. So what Farage is doing is dragging certainly the Conservative Party and maybe in part the Labour Party too behind in their wake. Do you think both the two main parties are making a mistake by engaging with Reform and Farage on this territory?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's like busing a non-league football team into the Etihad and getting them to play Man City on their home turf. This has been Farage's core terrain and his core arguments for 20 or 25 years. Politicians on the centre-right and the centre-left all over Europe have tried this strategy of essentially trying to adopt the language and positions of the radical right on immigration, on integration, on social change. It has never worked. The kind of question isn't so much, will it work? The question is, why do they keep thinking it will work? Because it just doesn't. I mean, the Conservatives polling under Badenoch has fallen 7 or 8 points, and most of that has gone to Reform UK. So the net product of spending a year competing on Nigel Farage's terrain is to hand another 8% of the electorate into Nigel Farage's column. At some point, you've got to say to yourselves, this is not working. We should try something else.
And the tactic that Keir Starmer and indeed most cabinet ministers adopted at the Labour Party conference, which was to not completely, but effectively ignore the Conservatives and focus on Reform and Farage as the opposition, and then to demonise them, which is what they did, and to use robust language, to put it mildly. And then you got people like David Lammy wanting to remind voters that in his youth, apparently, Farage flirted with some pretty nasty racist politics. Is that also simply repeating mistakes that have been made in other places, which is you are throwing fuel on the fire?
Well, I think that with that strategy on the Labour side, you can see a bit more of a logic to it than with the Conservative side, because the Conservatives are fishing in the same pond in terms of voters with Reform. Labour mostly aren't. In fact, much of their mistake in the first year has been assuming that they are. And so drawing these bright lines with Reform makes a kind of sense, because where have Labour lost most of their votes in government? It isn't to Reform, it's to the Greens and the Lib Dems and to non-voting, because people find them uninspiring and unambitious. But in-group out-group politics works in all parts of the political spectrum. So if you're on the progressive left, then you see Reform as the threat, you see Reform as the danger, you see Reform as the agents of dark things. And arguments that portray them that way can motivate you, can pull you back into the Labour camp. The worry I have about it as a strategy is you still have to offer people a positive alternative. You can't just say it's us or this and this is bad if, as far as people can see, the package that Labour are offering doesn't amount to, a hill of beans. So a lot of the voters who are going over to the Greens in particular would say, well, you say it's us or Reform, but you don't sound or look any different to Reform. You're not delivering anything. So why should we prop you up just because you want to fearmonger about Reform? So I think it isn't enough as a strategy, but it does make more sense for Labour to behave that way and try and draw a bright line distinction with Reform than it does for the Conservatives to try and, imitate. I like to describe it on social media as being the strategy of Nigel Farage is right, don't vote for him. That's not a message that makes sense if you're Conservative.
What if Nigel Farage ever becomes Prime Minister? What will happen to the UK immigration?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Actually, we were speculating about all these scenarios. We didn't actually talk about this. I think this event is called Prime Minister Farage. We haven't actually talked about what that would be like.
I think it would be very turbulent, especially at the beginning. So I don't know how familiar those of you in the audience are with what's been happening under President Trump in his second term. You're having people being pulled off the street by guys in balaclavas, sent to prisons in El Salvador, including people who have a legal right to be in America. You have tens of billions of dollars being committed to this enormous immigration police force, and a lot of people going into hiding, living in fear. Now, I'm genuinely, sincerely not sure how far down that road Farage would go, but he would definitely go some way down that road. And one of the troubling things as a specialist in British politics, always, I'm sure you know this as well, David, is there are so few constitutional and institutional constraints on what a government with a majority can do. If he wanted to create such an immigration police force, he could just do it. If he wanted to abolish institutions that got in his way, he could just do it. And so I think it would be very stressful, anxious, uncertain times, for sure. The only thing that would be constraining him is a sense that he's gone too far in terms of the British public. And that's not nothing, but it's not a lot.
Let's play along with your scenario where Reform form for next government. How does Reform square for the circle of the second chamber with the House of Lords, with Conservatives currently having 285 peers, Labour just under 210, and Reform none?
That's a great question, actually. First thing to point out is that opposition from the House of Lords is like, manna from heaven from Farage in terms of his populist arguments. Because it would be like a bunch of appointed hacks from the parties that have just been killed off telling us we can't do what we want to do. So he won't mind that in a sense. It suits his agenda. I suspect that will be one of the sources of friction early on, that the Lords will try and stop things that they regard as violating basic fundamental principles of the rule of law, human rights and so on. But there is a sort of well-established convention in the British system that a government with a majority, I'm not sure how it would work with a minority government, but even then, like if Reform was saying this was a manifesto commitment, we're doing this, the Lords by convention don't try and stop it. So I suspect there would be a lot of argument. There's also the question of what Farage would want to do in terms of constitutional reform. He's sort of talked out of both sides of his mouth in terms of the House of Lords. Sometimes he's like, it's an anachronism, I'd get rid of it. I can see how it would suit him to have a sort of second chamber that's maybe directly elected as well, if Reform are high in the polls. Or he may think, well, this is a great place to stuff a lot of people who've given me money, just as other parties have in the past, and just kind of accelerate that process and say, well, this would give him a kind of pretext for doing that, to say, it's unrepresentative, politics has changed, so, I'm going to pension off 200 of these people and replace them with 200 of my own appointments, and that's just fair because we've got a majority in the Commons. So I think there are lots of ways it could go. I suspect the House of Lords would change quite rapidly, but at least at the beginning probably would put a bit of a brake on him as well.
I mean, the other thing to say about Nigel Farage is all the time that you've been studying him until maybe, 6 months ago, he was passionately in favour of reforming the first-past-the-post system and replacing it with some form of proportional representation because it was so unfair, the scenario you described, when they won 15% of the vote and 0.2. But for some reason that I can't put my finger on, he's changed his view about that, and he now seems quite comfortable with the first-past-the-post system.
Yeah, it's remarkable, isn't it, how the enthusiasm politicians have for PR is very closely tied
For
to
principled opposition to PR. I mean, the thing is, he was making his case entirely on principled ground, but somehow the principles have changed.
Somehow he's reassessing his principles. The Conservatives, incidentally, have been travelling quite rapidly in the opposite direction. You can get quite a lot of Conservatives being enthusiastic about PR on the record now, which wasn't true when they had a majority in the Commons.
For the people who are on the progressive left and see Reform as the opposition, do you think that they should join votes and vote Labour just so Reform don't have a chance to get into Prime Minister, or do you think they'll be fine voting what they actually want?
Well, I think this is actually it's one of the scenarios we didn't discuss in terms of, because I said Reform could get a majority on 30%, but the way that happens is because support is so evenly divided across the other parties. You've got the Greens over 10%, you've got the Lib Dems at about 15%, and you've got Labour at about 20%. Add those together, and that's a lot more than the Reform vote. It's getting up for 45% of the vote. And I think there will be a lot of pressure on supporters of the smaller parties to rally behind Labour. Or you can see them already conceiving this strategy. But there will also need to be a quid pro quo. So I suspect that, the ask that the Lib Dems or the Greens would have is, well, you've got to support us in some seats as well and recognise that, you need our help, so you need to offer us something in exchange. But I think it will become a real conversation. And I think when you see these mega polls, these MRP polls that say, Reform can get to 300 seats, that is assuming nobody looks at their local seat and says, okay, so it's Labour 20%, Greens 20% and Reform 25%, and I get a Reform MP. I don't want that. And we saw in the last general election, a lot of voters did exactly this. They coordinated behind whoever could beat the Conservatives locally. So people clearly can and do that. And so you could have Reform 30% in a majority, or Reform 30% and only on 50 or 60 seats, depending upon how the voters on the left choose to coordinate. So in that sense, the fate of the government from the perspective of progressive left voters is in their hands as well. But you have to vote for Labour to stop Nigel Farage, as I say, potentially quite a hollow argument. So there needs to be more to it than just keep this guy out, I suspect, at least for some of those voters.
And just touching on something I said earlier, in this country, there's not much of a tradition of politicians working out how to form this kind of popular front. But as Rob says, there is a tradition of voters working it out. But it's quite difficult, actually, when it gets really fragmented to know what to do. And this is a much more fragmented political landscape than I think we have ever seen because of the range of parties. I want to vote tactically, but actually without a steer from the politicians, it could be quite hard.
It could be, and it's one of the reasons why the local council elections in the next few years are going to be very important, not just for who ends up running town halls and so on, but because if you are, for example, the Greens, and you want to say, here are 20 seats that under a progressive front we want, Labour and the Lib Dems out of, if they're seats where every single councillor is Green, it's much easier to make that case. Easier to make that case to voters, easier to make that case to the other parties. And my suspicion is that Labour will lose an awful lot of ground in local government, which in a weird sort of way actually may help them at a general election because it becomes much clearer whose turf is whose. Much easier to signal to voters, this is a Green seat that you're in now, this is a Lib Dem seat you're in now, this is a Labour seat you're in now, because you can see it from the recent election results as well as from the MRP polls and stuff. So those signals could become very important. And I think one lesson from last year's general election is that parties have got more adept at transmitting them, voters have got more adept at picking them up, and certainly the looming threat of a Farage government on less than a third of the vote gives people a strong incentive to try and figure out what they should do.
It's going to be an interesting 3 years, and I think it is true. I don't know the exact age profile of the younger people we have in this room, but everyone in this room will have a vote because the voting age will be lowered, we think, to 16. So if you do have a vote, you should use it. Next time, we are going to be resuming our series on fixing democracy, talking about the ideas that could make democracy go better and talking about some of the things that have gone wrong. It's a conversation with the writer Sam Friedman, who's the author of the most popular politics Substack in the UK. And we're going to be talking about social media, information, disinformation, and TikTok. How much does it matter where we get our news from? That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.